It's just a little bit after 12, and it looks like our numbers are kind of leveling off around 23. So I just want to first welcome everyone to our third research conversation of this semester. Thank our previous presenters and also A.G. Rudd and Laura Girardeau for helping organize these. We are in the process of planning our next three for the spring semester, and I hope to release those, hopefully early January or by the end of December. So thanks everyone for joining today. And I'll turn it over to A.G. Rudd for the introduction.
Thank you, Brian. It's been great working with you and Laura on this wonderful project. And I think it's great to highlight the research of our faculty in the college and to share it with others. Today is a presentation that goes straight to my heart because I'm a huge sport and society kind of a person, an inquirer. I can't say I'm a scholar the way that our guest is, but I'm very interested in sports. I'm very interested in collegiate sports. And so today we have Scott R. Jedlicka, an assistant professor in the sport management program at WSU, and he's going to be talking about measuring return on investment in intercollegiate athletics. Very timely topic. Scott, it's all yours.
Thank you, AG and Brian and Laura for your help in getting this set up and inviting me to speak here today. This is a project, as AG said, is very timely, certainly here at WSU and more generally, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But it is something that I've become more interested in at a research level of late. A lot of my previous research is focused on international sport, but I have kind of begun to focus or expand my my research program under the umbrella of governance and strategic decision making to also examine intercollegiate sport, given all of the different issues that are swirling around this particular area of the sport industry. And so this is a project I've been working on for a little bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background for it, share some preliminary results. Don't have everything in the books yet, but and then yeah, we'll hopefully have time for a lot of questions and answers and comments and so forth. But for the few graduate students here who were in my governance class last spring that was regretfully abbreviated since we had to move online. This is, I actually mentioned this in that class several months ago, and so now you're seeing things come full circle. So I'm going to move fairly quickly through kind of the background philosophical stuff and get into the actual research and methodology, but I think it's important to kind of trace the pathway here, trace the thinking that kind of informs this project and why I kind of took it on. Let's see if I can make this go. So I think, you know, if you're here, if you're watching this, you probably have some familiarity with the broader context or kind of the hot button issues that are currently being debated and discussed in intercollegiate sport right now. These are just a few of them, but I think they capture most of the smaller, more specific debates. One, of course, being rising expenditures. This has been going on for some time now. It's not a new phenomenon, certainly. In some cases, at least, this is driven by rising revenues, but not always. Certainly, especially since the pandemic hit, we've seen a resurgence in interest or concern about athlete well-being. Certainly playing while being at risk for contracting COVID-19 is at the forefront, but also more general concerns about you know, long-term health impacts, abuse of various kinds, and you know, the long-standing tension with academics. That you know, the question of compatibility and whether athletics should or can be a part of the academic mission is one that is kind of fundamental to the enterprise, but has seen renewed kind of intensity of late as scandals involving academic fraud and so forth have captured national attention. But given all of these different issues, given all of these different concerns, the question I think is, or that we continue to come back to in various ways, is how do we characterize the benefit of athletics to the university, to higher education institutions? And I'm not going to answer that here today, because I don't think anyone has a definitive answer to that. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that as kind of the driving question behind a lot of these tensions and a lot of these issues that we see and that we talk about on a fairly regular basis. So if we're considering kind of the question of how do we characterize the benefit of athletics, this is something that I used to lecture on when I taught sport ethics. I haven't dusted this off in a while, but if we think about this question of how to characterize the benefit of athletics to higher education, I think, to maybe overgeneralize just a little bit, there's kind of three views of sport and higher ed, and this relationship between the two. The first one, of course, is the idea or the position that these are totally incompatible things and need to be separate. That athletics has no place at the university, and there's really no reason for universities to sponsor these programs, to engage in intercollegiate competition, that sort of thing. The second view, which I think is maybe epitomized by the NCAA Division III model, is the kind of amateur muscular Christianity type view of athletics that truly sees it as an extension of the academic mission, that athletics teaches important lessons, confers positive character traits, and can actually be sort of integrated into academics and support that broader educational mission. And I referenced the D3 model because this is a level of intercollegiate sport that does not use athletic scholarships, so students are not compensated via scholarship for their athletic participation. Relatively little national media attention, certainly. Relatively little in the way of athletics generated revenue. And it is, something that is often pointed to as kind of as emblematic of this particular vision of sport and higher education. The third one, of course, which has become more prominent and more mainstream at the upper levels of intercollegiate sport, is the idea that athletics' primary role is to provide kind of a supporting function for the university's operations. And this supporting function is essentially to brand and promote the institution, that our athletic programs serve as kind of a vehicle for advertising who we are, that we're here, that we are a place that people would want to know about, pay attention to, enroll at, work at, things like that. And so I think these three different views kind of capture the range of thinking on the relationship between sport and higher education. And given that this third one here is most prominent at the Division I level, and at the level where we see a lot of these debates that I was talking about on the previous slide, we're going to kind of use that as our jumping off point here for digging into the thinking and the reasoning that goes into justifying athletics in this way, that athletics performs this function for the university. And if we sort of take that as our premise, we can begin to ask questions about how it can do that, and how it can do that as efficiently and effectively as possible. This is my attempt to kind of present a theory of athletics as a promotional tool. I don't know that anyone's ever sort of laid this out in the academic literature, I think it's kind of assumed a lot of times. But in terms of how we get from this idea that athletics promotes the university to the benefit, the mechanisms through which this process begins to take place are both psychological and structural. At the psychological level, of course, the so-called Flutie effect, where success in sport translates into more enthusiasm among stakeholders, among potential enrollees and students. Sort of provides this boost of enthusiasm surrounding the university. And then the structural mechanism is just kind of the passive exposure that can be obtained via broadcasting. That by sponsoring athletics and sponsoring big time athletics in particular, we can get sports games on television, and for 2 or 3 hours or so on a weekend or on a weeknight, we're talking about basketball, the university's name, logo is being featured on a national broadcasting network. And through this exposure, people learn about, become familiar with, gain some knowledge about the university. And via these mechanisms, this is at least theorized to improve the institution's visibility. If we're talking about competitive success, which we're going to dig into more in just a second, also maybe increases the institution's prestige. And this can also, I think, occur via affiliation. If we're, regardless of the success of a particular team or program, if we're affiliated with a conference with a particular level of competition, this is at least believed to connote something about the university. But then through this increased visibility, this improved prestige, this expansion of brand equity, essentially, we get the benefits that we are supposed to see on the back end. Increase in the number and quality of applications, better able to attract top tier faculty, top tier leadership, private donations, alumni donations, support from the local community. All of this is, at least again, theorized to result from using athletics in this way. And sort of viewing and managing athletics as this tool to promote the university. So with that kind of theoretical background in mind, this is where I began. This is where I kind of began to dig into this project, because I was talking to Dr. Cruz on Tuesday, who couldn't be here unfortunately, but she was sort of describing this this kind of theoretical or theorized cause and effect in the same way as the educational black box that might be familiar to some of our audience, that instruction goes into the student and something happens and then education comes out the back end. And a similar thing, I think, is taking place here. And so as I was trying to kind of open that black box and sort of think about, well, can we break this process down even more, think more concretely about the steps that could lead to these theorized outcomes, it seemed to me that if we're accepting this kind of theoretical process as accurate, as something that actually happens, which is debatable, but let's just sort of run with it. If we accept that this works, or it can work, the first step, at least in my view, to making these dominoes fall over, that go from a game being broadcast on TV, a team being put out there representing the university, all of this is kind of predicated on the assumption of competitive success. If we're talking about the Flutie effect, to the extent that this happens at all, the research that has been done on this has pretty consistently confirmed that the prerequisite for that Flutie effect to occur is national level competitive success. You know, we see this during March Madness, for instance, when an underdog has a big upset and they're talking about how this is going to benefit admissions and so forth. All of this can be traced back to sort of the instigating moment of national level success, of achieving some level of competitive success that allows people to have that enthusiasm surrounding athletics. And a similar thing is true when it comes to just exposure and getting on national television. If we're talking about kind of the high profile sports, football and men's basketball, generally speaking, to get selected for national TV games, you have to be good. You have to be a competitive team if you want to get on national TV consistently. And this is especially true for the non-revenue generating sports, where national exposure really only occurs if you qualify for an NCAA championship. Aside from that, your team really doesn't get on television, at least not at the national level. And this is changing somewhat as the major conferences get carriage of their conference networks on major distributors. So that's changing somewhat, but I did get a message from AG that some of our listeners might not know what the Flutie effect is or what that reference means. And I'll try to explain it very briefly, but Doug Flutie was a quarterback, a fairly talented quarterback. He went on to play in the NFL, but in 1984, I believe, he was at Boston College, not very well known for its football success, but he played in a game against Miami, who during the 1980s and 1990s had a very good football program, and upset the Miami Hurricanes on a Hail Mary last play of the game pass. And as a consequence, there was all this attention focused on Boston College, and they reported that they had this spike in admissions interest and so forth. And so the Flutie effect was born, and so this is still talked about today as kind of a dynamic that occurs when a relatively maybe low profile institution attains some level of competitive success on the national stage. But that's who Doug Flutie is, and that's where the name comes from. But I guess that's getting to be a while ago now. Since the Flutie effect first took place, but to kind of
he also got the Heisman Trophy.
That's true.
So I was just wondering, maybe you can talk about this later. Was it the Flutie effect, the Hail Flutie, or was it the Heisman, or both?
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, I think today it's more referred to team success or institutional success, but I think there is something to be said for individual level kind of notoriety also performing the same function. But if we kind of take this premise of competitive success as the first step or the first domino that has to fall in order for all of these other benefits to occur, then the question, at least in my mind, is how do we measure that success? Because it might seem fairly straightforward, but once you kind of dig into it, it's not necessarily as easy as it looks, or as straightforward as it looks. If we want to kind of measure this, or perform some sort of large scale analysis of competitive success, it becomes evident pretty quickly that it's difficult to kind of standardize regular season or season long results across sports. Certainly team sports play discrete games, football games, baseball games, basketball games, and so forth. Your maybe quote unquote individual sports have meets or competitions where there's only one winner, or team scores might not even be kept, like track and cross country and so forth. So it becomes very difficult to do this in any kind of meaningful way. The one system that is pretty widely accepted, I think, for performing this measurement and actually getting kind of a standardized look at department level competitive performance is what's called the Director's Cup, and it's currently sponsored by Learfield IMG. But this is a competition, I guess, if you want to call it that, that athletic departments participate in throughout each academic year. And essentially, without getting into the nitty-gritty of it, how it works is for every sport in which there's an NCAA championship, athletic departments can earn points based on their performance in those championships, and those scores are tallied up, and the university that has the most at the end of the year, once all of the championships are completed, wins the Director's Cup. The one exception to this is football bowl subdivision or Division 1A football that doesn't have a NCAA championship, and so for that sport, the coaches poll is used along with bowl game appearances to assign points for programs in that sport. But what I really like about this system, beyond the fact that it's recognized, it's consistent, it's been in place since at least the mid-90s, is that it does weight all sports equally or have a consistent scoring procedure for all sports. And again, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty too much. The tiers are adjusted for field size, so championships with more teams have more points distributed, but winning a national championship regardless of sport is weighted equally within the system. And so there has been a lot of work done using the Director's Cup system to kind of look at what drives success in the Director's Cup. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, large athletic departments do better in the Director's Cup, largely because they can fund more sports programs, so they can go and earn more points in those championships, and so they tend to have more points at the end of the year. So in looking at the Director's Cup and thinking about this system and how we might use it to measure competitive success beyond just aggregate performance, these are kind of some of the questions or considerations that I was looking at in developing this project. First, is there a way to control for that advantage that large athletic departments might have? And certainly the disparities in capabilities across NCAA D1, that your Power 5 institutions are going to, on average, do better and have better performances than other schools. Certainly, can we try to account for the different costs or the different ostensible benefits of different sports? The Director's Cup, is consistent in terms of how it assigns points, but this is also a drawback in the sense that winning a national championship in football is very different from winning a national championship in water polo or field hockey or something like that. And so, can we try to account for that difference in still kind of using this system, but in a way that takes that into account? And so what I kind of settled on here as a way to account for these disparities and across different sports, across different departments, across different schools, is the concept of return on investment. And actually the inspiration for that I got from tweet by our athletic director, Pat Chun, a couple of years ago, when he was citing the fact that WSU athletics and WSU football in particular, who was doing very well at the time, had a very low level of expenses relative to other Power 5 teams. And so using that kind of concept of return on investment as a way to produce some sort of measure of success or measure of athletic department performance that can account for these things. One final thing to keep in mind, and this is, I think, something that is misunderstood a lot of times when we talk about athletic department finances, is that we can't simply, look at revenues and expenses and calculate a simple return on investment. This is because, and this is again not something that's often acknowledged, I think, athletic departments, like any university department, are not profit maximizers. They are incentivized to spend their budget. They are not distributing dividends to shareholders. They are not profit seekers in the traditional sense. And so we can't really use traditional measures of ROI where we would, calculate the return or the net return on our expenses and then calculate that as a percentage of the outlay. We instead have to think about this in a little bit different way. And so this is the procedure. This is the measure that I came up with and am in kind of the process of testing to use this concept of return on investment, but in a way that gets away from, again, treating athletic departments as profit maximizers and instead looking more specifically at competitive success. So what I've done here is first establish within the Director's Cup system a value of the points in that sport for each particular year. And this is done by taking the number of points that are available in a sport, and I'll show an example here in just a second, dividing that by the total amount spent on the sport by all institutions, and using that calculation to arrive at a point value for a particular sport in a particular year. And then we'll come back to this slide in a second, but I've been able to finalize this. There's a lot of methodological things that I could get into that make this process not as easy as it might seem, but this is the point value calculation for the 03-04 academic year. So what we see here, the filter icons are kind of covering up the labels, but obviously the year, the total points that were distributed via the Director's Cup system in that particular sport, the total amount across NCAA Division I that was spent on that sport across all institutions, and then obviously in the final column, the calculated point value for each of those sports. So what 1 point earned in each of those sports would be worth to an institution in a kind of financial sense. And I think this is this is a way of kind of attaching a financial number to competitive success that hasn't really been done before, and is rooted in, as it says here, kind of in an idea of how institutions are, as a collective whole, valuing success in that sport. As we see here, there's obviously more money spent on football and basketball than there are on most other sports, and that is kind of reflected in the point values for those sports. Earning a point in FBS football is worth several orders of magnitude more than earning a point in fencing. or something like that. So I think it's a fairly novel way of converting competitive on-field, on-court, in pool, what have you, success into a financial number that is reflective of the value that is placed on that success. And so the next steps then in this procedure were to use those point values that I showed you on the previous slide to calculate a total generated value for each institution in each year. And again, I just have the 1 year kind of finalized and cleaned up, so I'm just sticking with that for now in terms of this presentation. But this is very simply done by summing the point values earned by each, or the points earned by each institution by the point values for each sport. And this computation produces a total generated value for each institution. And once you have that number, it's very easy to calculate a return on investment, where the total generated value through competitive success less the expenditure of the department gives you a return on investment expressed in the traditional percentage form. So I'm going to share with you, I've shared the point values of for the 03-04 academic year. I'll share with you kind of a few kind of broad level findings, have kind of a quick discussion on the outliers or the anomalies that I think are kind of interesting, and then wrap things up so we have some time to get into questions. But if we're looking at the ROI breakdown across Division I for the 03-04 academic year, we can see here that you know, most institutions based on this calculation had a negative return. A few had fairly high returns, and there was kind of about 10% or so that were kind of having a modest success rate or a modest return on investment. But digging into these schools that had positive ROIs, they're presented in two columns here, but you know, a few things kind of stand out initially, as we can see in the left-hand graphic here. Most of the institutions that have the highest ROIs are FCS schools, and this is not particularly surprising to me, given that these are schools that have much smaller athletic budgets on the whole, but still are competing and having success in a sport that is still pretty highly valued based on the total expenditure. Relatively few Power 5 teams, and again, this kind of predates the Power 5. But aside from the ACC and SEC, not too many schools that are seeing a positive ROI here. But aside from this, it's a fairly diverse group of schools, and it kind of runs the gamut from you know, institutions that obviously have a very low total expenditure, and thus, you know, success is going to very quickly result in positive return. But we also have, you know, schools like LSU and Duke and so forth that are spending tens of millions of dollars on athletics and still are able to generate a positive return. I'm not going to be able to dig into each of these, obviously, but what I did want to emphasize here, and we can certainly pull this back up at some point if we need to, but a couple of insights here in terms of the results, and looking specifically at this group of positive ROI institutions. Roughly 60% were schools that earned points in either FBS or FCS football. If we go back just a second, you know, very few schools in the division category that are non-football playing schools. On top of this, if we look at the other 22 that did not earn points in football, most of those earned points in men's or women's basketball. And I should say 19 out of 22, not 16. But, at first blush, and I haven't had a chance to really kind of dig into more robust analyses of this, doing any sort of regression on the ROI variable. But, this does suggest, at least at first blush, that success in either football or basketball is a necessary but not sufficient condition for generating positive ROI. And this raises further strategic considerations about, what made the schools that had success in those sports different from the ones that also had success but didn't have a positive ROI. And this, points to questions about cost containment, whether you're able to have other success outside of football and basketball to generate ROI. But what I wanted to look at here, at least briefly, were the three that the three institutions that had a positive ROI but did not have any points earned in football or basketball. And each of these schools, if you're familiar with them, are small private schools. Brown is obviously an Ivy League school. Pepperdine and Santa Clara, both smaller institutions in California. But the blueprints here, I think, are kind of unique and distinctive for each institution, and maybe point to models that could be adopted or at least considered at a more general level or on a wider scale. Certainly for Pepperdine, you've got a school with a relatively small athletic budget, but that is nonetheless having success in quite a few team sports, soccer, volleyball, baseball, certainly all traditional team sports. And even tennis is a team sport for NCAA championship purposes, at least as it's used in the Directors Cup. Same thing with golf, but in a little bit different way. Whereas Brown, most of their value generated comes from winning the national championship in rowing and having some other minor successes in the Olympic sports, I guess you could call them. And then Santa Clara is one where the smallest of these three in terms of total expenditures, and having pretty significant success, especially in men's soccer. I think they went to the Final Four, the Final Eight this year, and then also in volleyball and women's soccer. So a relatively small number of sports, but having elevated levels of success within those sports. But I did think these were interesting just to look at because they are suggestive of other approaches or other ways of generating positive return that don't necessarily depend upon football and basketball. So to wrap things up, since we hopefully have about 20 minutes for questions, I won't talk through all of these, but in terms of the value added of this approach or the contribution that it makes, in my mind, at least, it is a way of better capturing what athletic departments do, again, assuming that their function is to promote the institution. It gets away from this question about revenue generation, from the idea that we have to spend money just to keep up with everyone else, and really sort of refocuses the conversation on efficiency. And it also, I think, opens up the door, as we saw on the previous slide, for looking at different strategic mixtures that might open up other pathways for using sports to promote the university that don't necessarily depend exclusively on football and men's basketball. Certainly there are drawbacks here, as I've listed under the limitations heading. I think those are fairly self-explanatory, so I won't talk anymore. I'll wrap things up so we do have some time to take questions or comments on this or on college sports in general. I don't know if AG, are you going to monitor the chat or do you call on
Yes,
people?
yes. That was terrific, Scott. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll moderate the chat here, and if people can put questions into the chat, and Scott, I'll copy that for you and send it to you. But we were also recording this.
Okay.
But I thought I'd take the prerogative to just start off by asking about this. I was very intrigued by a number of things. I could talk to you for all afternoon, but I won't. But the sort of ROI question. I noticed that Duke was very high, was the highest Power 5 school in that ROI designation, and I assume that came from men's basketball especially, but also football. I wanted to ask you about Boise State, because Boise State is a very interesting sort of case in intercollegiate athletics. It's a university that has really risen in national prominence, I think, more than sports, but on the vehicle of sports in many regards. People know about it. And I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about that. Am I wrong, or is there more to say about that and things of that nature?
Yeah, Boise's an interesting study because it is a school that has had outsized success in football in particular. I would have to go back and sort of empirically verify this, but I feel like, and this is why I think kind of the next step here is longitudinal analysis. One kind of interesting thing with Boise and maybe with a school like Gonzaga as well is the extent to which success begets success. Because Boise State is also, I think, elevated its performance level in men's basketball, certainly. Has had some success in track and cross country. And I would have to look at what the cause and effect there might be, but I do think that it is schools like that do kind of raise some interesting questions about whether over a longer term, heavy investment in one particular sport like football or basketball can lead to maybe a more sustainable level of competitive performance that doesn't depend so heavily on success in that one particular sport.
Thank you. Others, any other questions? Folks, jump right in if you would.
Oh. Hi, Scott. This is Kristen.
Hi.
So I don't know that I really have a question. It's just I'm thinking about so many other factors and variables and how it's even possible to incorporate some of them. Like you said, part of it is that like success breeds success, right? So you have a winning season, or you make it so far in the final, towards the Final Four or something, then you're going to have a better recruiting system, right? So there's like all these other things. Then you bring in different athletes. So there's that. And then the other effect in terms of, well, if you've got success in sport A, then you also probably have some enhanced training facilities that the other sports can then build off of, right? So in some way, I mean, obviously this is cool in terms of like separating, but there's things that you can't really separate. So I'm just wondering about your thinking about how you deal with all those integrated factors.
Yeah, it is something that, I mean, is obviously the case. I mean, you're exactly right that where we kind of begin the cycle, what point in the circle do we jump in at, right? I don't know. I guess for my part, the goal here was not necessarily to isolate what drives success, but to introduce a new way of considering athletic department performance. So not necessarily getting to the level of, whether one institution or the other, one sport or the other has an advantage, but sort of looking at and measuring, a department's performance relative to its circumstances. Because I think it's easy to point to, the largest conferences and the largest schools, and say, well, they're in a class apart and they kind of have to be judged by a different standard than schools in the Mountain West or Conference USA or the West Coast Conference or the Ivy League or what have you. And so I think what this metric does is put all schools on a level playing field in terms of measuring their success against their expenditures, in a way that is consistent across all schools. I don't know if that answers your question, but that was kind of my motivation for it.
Other questions? Well, I'll ask a quick one. I mean, unless my eyes are failing me, the only Big Ten school on here is Minnesota at the very bottom with a 0.47 ROI. So that means all of the other schools are below that, of course. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because the Big Ten prides itself on being a strong athletic and academic conference.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see, as I am able, just as a brief aside, the IATA data, where all the finances come from, it's available on a year-by-year basis, and every file is formatted a little bit differently. So it takes a little bit to get everything lined up. But yeah, the Big Ten is an interesting case study, and it does, I think, maybe, and one I think contribution of this could be to sort of highlight where the arms race has really push schools over the edge. That if you've got a situation where all schools in a particular conference or in a particular kind of similar setting are all, spending at a similar level and all sort of failing to recoup that investment, to use the concept, then I think that can sort of say, well, maybe we need to, again, either scale back our expenditures or do some things so that we're not overspending relative to our competitive success. I'll be interested to see as I go forward in this, and as expenditures continue to rise, how that will impact the ROI, because it does sort of progress in parallel. Yes, universities are going to be spending more. I would say that looking at like LSU and Georgia, these are schools that are now in the most recent years approaching 9 figures in terms of expenditures. So as that goes up, how that impacts ROI, because yes, expenditures are going to go up, but it's also true that because the value of the points are tied to those expenditures, that the value of the points will go up as well. So yeah, it's an interesting question with regard to the Big Ten. And yeah, I don't know. It may be the case that schools are just again maybe overspending. There's another kind of minor issue here that I've gone back and forth on, and it's whether to include overhead, basically, because these expenditure totals right now include what are called non-allocated expenses. So expenses that are in the budget, but that are not attached to any particular program. And I use that figure because I think it better captures overall expenditure. than just using, expenses that are tied to particular teams. But it does kind of raise a question of, well, is this fair? Is this the best way to measure this? Because certainly the larger schools are more likely to have more overhead. They're going to have more facility expenses. They're going to pay higher coaching salaries, things like that. So more support staff, things like that. So yeah, I see there's a couple of questions in the chat.
Scott, there are 2 questions there in the chat. If you could address those.
I'll go to Tabiti's first. How are you doing, Tabiti? I haven't seen you in a while. It's been a couple of years.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing well. Doing well.
Yeah. So kind of to AG's question. Ohio State, Michigan, other Big Ten schools. It's a situation where, even though they may have had some success in those revenue producing sports, those are not by themselves the only things taken into account here. So it could be the fact that, yes, they're maybe having some success, but that success is not very valuable relative to the overall departmental expenditure. But to Ann's question, I think the value here for institutions is to maybe within kind of this broader context of critiques about finances and how much athletics is spending and so on and so forth. Use this as kind of a different way of assessing whether the expenses that are being made for athletics are coming back to the department in a meaningful way. I think it's kind of conventional wisdom to say, well, we've made it to a bowl game in football. That's really what we need to do. But if the revenue that is generated through football, the expenditure that is made on other sports is not really allowing or is not really going anywhere for the institutions, on balance, is that a wise use of funds? Do we need to spend $90 million to go to the Sun Bowl, and all of our other teams are mediocre and don't really do anything for us in terms of promotion? I think that's an honest question to ask, and I think this metric can kind of reveal where the weaknesses might be for any given department, as well as where there might be opportunities. To have success in sports that are not maybe as widely competed in, or that might be lucrative in terms of exposure, but that might not have the same barriers or obstacles to success as the more intensely competed sports. So I think it kind of offers a way out of the deadlock between critics of large budgets who say this is excessive and we shouldn't be doing this, and those who say, well, we have to, because this is what we have to do to keep up, right? And I think maybe looking more precisely at how that money is being spent and what the return on it actually is a way that can again break that standoff in a way that hasn't really been tried before, I guess.
Other questions, anyone?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it wasn't the case in this particular year, and that's why I think I'm going to try to develop a more kind of longitudinal measure here that takes multiple years into account. But I would think that a school like WSU, just to kind of use an example, because our athletic expenditures are relatively low, we are a kind of archetype of having a relatively lower threshold to achieve a positive ROI. That because we keep our expenses low, if we're ranked in the top 10 for football and we go to the NCAA tournament and volleyball and basketball and pick up a few points in track or golf, that very quickly adds up for us in a way that a school like Texas that's spending $120 million is going to have a harder time doing. So again, I think the broader implication is, again, looking kind of across the entire landscape, is sort of opening up new ways of thinking about what models might work beyond, again, sort of heavy investment in football and men's basketball, because those are the high profile sports, and then hope everything else sorts itself out. That maybe there are opportunities to be the very best tennis program in the NCAA, and use that as a promotional platform, again, in a way that hasn't really been tried. I think it's kind of assumed that doesn't work, or that wouldn't be effective, but I don't know that it's really been attempted by anyone, at least not in a concerted way. So again, kind of from the perspective of institutional governance and thinking about departmental strategy, I think it's a way to reconceptualize how athletic departments might be measured that hasn't really been kind of introduced yet.
We have time for one more question. Scott, I wanted to just quickly ask you, have you spoken to athletic directors, not necessarily Pat Chun, but others, about what you're doing, and what has been their reaction if you have?
No, I haven't. I'm having Brian Blair actually come talk to my class next week, and I know that he's been someone that's been at the helm of developing the new strategic plan for WSU athletics, where the Directors' Cup and finishing highly in those standings is a key component of that. So yeah, I'm hoping to use that opportunity to kind of broach the subject with him, because I think he is someone that's kind of in the mix in terms of, and I think is also open to thinking about these sorts of things. But Riley asks, no, the value generated is tied directly to competitive success. And again, in the broader kind of context of the process, the idea is that if you have a positive ROI, then this better enables you to generate things like donations and more applications and that sort of thing at the very end of the process. But that can't really occur, or that can't really take place, unless that positive ROI is in place. Does that make sense?
Well, thank you, Scott. We're at the end of our time, and I've got so many more questions. I'm sure everyone else does, but I know that you'll continue your work, and we can badger you with these questions about sports and the investment in higher education. I really appreciate it. Let's give a hand for Scott and his presentation today, which I thought was great.
Thank you again for having me, and for giving me the opportunity to kick this into overdrive a little bit so I could be ready for this presentation. Always good to have that motivation. But yeah, thank you again, and good to see people I haven't seen in a while. And yeah, have a good rest of the semester, good weekend, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Brian, do you want to say anything about that you said at the beginning for folks who may have missed it, just quickly? Or
Yeah, just that we're in the process of planning. Well, first, thanks, Scott. It was great. We're in the process of planning for next semester, so hopefully that'll be out end of December, beginning of January with our next 3 to 4 sessions for spring. So please look forward to joining those, and I thank everyone for attending today.
thank you very
Bye,
much.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody. See you later. Great job.